So all of this buildup that we've been doing to a certain extent, especially last section, but also the previous two sections, are going to ultimately lead us down the primrose path to a Second World War. Now, the Second World War is going to be a far even more global war, more global conflict than even World War One. And it's going to have its independent origins in Asia and Europe. Actually, the beginning of World War Two is not going to be in Europe. It technically, the first aggressions of World War Two are actually going to be within Asia. And the road to war is pretty straightforward here. Japanese imperial ambitions are going to rise in the 1920s and 1930s. The big thing here, and I know that I've mentioned it before, but you want to put down here next to number one, you want to put down here unsatisfied by the Versailles Treaty, Japan thought they should get more. So when they don't get more, basically what they're going to do is they're going to take empire building into their own hands or continue to take it into their own hands. I mean, because we've seen Japanese empire building before when Japan had acquired influence in Manchuria after the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905 that we talked about last chapter. In 1931, Japanese military units are going to seize control of Manchuria. This is going to lead the West to criticize Japan, and this forces them to withdraw from the League of Nations. What you want to put down here next to B underneath number two is the League of Nations was unable to stop Japanese aggressions. One of the reasons why the League of Nations was unable to stop Japanese aggressions is because they had no oomph behind them, they had no muscle. So when Japan is going into Manchuria and doing all of these other things before they leave the League of Nations, the only thing the League of Nations can do is sort of kind of like snap their fingers and say, hey, don't do that. Sort of kind of like when I'm yelling at my cat and they just ignore me. Japan did essentially the exact same thing. By 1937, there's a major attack on the Chinese heartland that is going to start World War II in Asia. Um, you do want to put down here next to number three, underneath capital A, you want to put down that this starts, and put starts in quotes, the aggressions of World War II. This starts, and put starts in quotations, the aggressions of World War II. Jumping ahead here to 1940, 1941, Japan is going to launch a series of conquests against the European colonies, Indochina, Malay, Burma, Indonesia, and also the Philippines. And one of the ways that they're able to get as far as they do is that they present themselves as liberators of their fellow Asians. They present themselves as an alternative to the leadership of the Europeans. Spoiler alert, they're going to be just as horrible, if not worse, than the Europeans, but more often than not, just as bad as the Europeans because the Europeans are absolutely dreadful. The reality, again, like I said, was a highly brutal rule by the Japanese because they're using these places as, how do I put this? As kind of like launching off points and areas of much needed natural resources and raw materials in order to launch their war effort, which ultimately here is going to culminate in December of 1941 and the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, in Europe, slightly different thing, but it's going to be just as quickly. The Nazis are going to promise to rectify the injustices of Versailles. You want to put down here next to number one. This is a reason. This is a reason the European allies didn't stop earlier actions. I mean, everybody knew that the Versailles Treaty was screwed up. And one of the things, and I told you this before, one of the things they see, some of the first things that Hitler is doing is rectifying the known problems within the Versailles Treaty. And they just sort of kind of are sitting back going, oh, okay, well, there's no sense getting our panties in the bunch because we know that these are problems and he's just fixing them. And he says that he's just fixing the problems of the Versailles Treaty. At first, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union are unwilling to confront German aggression. Now, not only is this because they think that Hitler is fixing the problems of the Versailles Treaty, but the other reason and the bigger reason, and this is what I need you to get down here next to number two, is this grew out of increasing levels of pacifism and the memory of World War I losses. Everybody who was in government at this time in France, Britain, and the Soviet Union either A, participated in World War I as a member of the military, or somebody very close to them did. And every single time Hitler is doing something, even though they may not like it, even though they may raise their eyebrows at him going and saying, oh, well, I'm just fixing the problems of the Versailles Treaty, every time this happens, they're kind of asking themselves, is this worth it? Is this worth going and duplicating what we just experienced in the Great War? Is this worth another 6 to 9 million dead? Is this worth running the risk of another economic catastrophe? And for a while, every single time they ask that question, the answer is going to be no. War was perhaps actually desired by the Nazi leadership, for a couple reasons. One, Hitler's going to stress the need for living space or Lebensraum in Eastern Europe, and he's going to begin rearmament in 1935. You want to put down here next to B, underneath number three, that there's no real European backlash. There's no real European backlash. I mean, the French are going to be complaining, but the French are going to be complaining every single time the Germans are going to get a little uppity because they really see the Germans as kind of this impending threat. And the English really just simply don't want to deal with it. But eventually, the situation is going to become something that they can't ignore, that they can't just go and say, okay, he's fixing the Versailles Treaty, or, is this really worth another 6 to 9 million dead? And it's going to amp up here in 1938 with the annexation of Austria and the German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia. The catch here is that even though Hitler says that he's only taking a specific area of Czechoslovakia, he ultimately is going to take all of Czechoslovakia, even parts that he has no legitimate claim to. This is going to cause the Western Allies to start to really have a gut check. And they decide that they are going to draw a line in the sand. Hitler, in the summer of 1939, is making no bones about the fact that he's looking at Poland. England and France get together and they say, okay, look, he violates a Polish boundary. It is game on. We are at war. And that ultimately, here in September of 1939, he launches an attack on Poland, and that will start the military action in Europe for World War II. The Germans are going to quickly use a new tactic of blitzkrieg, which was initially very successful. This is hit them hard, hit them with everything you possibly have. And using blitzkrieg, Germany is going to quickly gain control of most of Europe. They're going to rapidly defeat France. They're going to launch an air war against Britain, but they decide it's going to be a great idea to invade the Soviet Union, who, by the way, they had allied themselves with in the summer of 1939. Eventually, here, the German advance is going to be stopped by a Soviet counterattack in 1942, and ultimately the Germans are going to be defeated in May of 1945. The outcome of the global conflict is going to be, again, because it's a bigger conflict, because it's more global, it's going to have a higher death count. It is estimated that 60 million people died in World War II, and that is a very conservative estimate. In fact, more than half of the casualties were civilians. The little note here I need you to add next to A underneath number one, you want to put down that this was a true total war. Even though we said that World War One was a total war, World War One was a total war up to that point. We go completely next level total war with World War Two. And one of the reasons why we have so many civilian casualties is because the line between the civilians and military targets were blurred. Very early on, we're seeing civilian and military targets pretty much being the basic same thing because there's an idea that if we go for the civilian targets, it's going to break the enemy's resolve and ability to continue to support the war effort. Just to give you an idea of the numbers that we're talking about, the Soviet Union is going to suffer more than 40% of the total number of deaths. I mean, these guys really, really take it on the chin. And in fact, because this is going to be something that we're going to mention a little bit later, you want to put down here next to number two underneath capital C that Stalin uses this as well as World War One losses to justify his takeover of Eastern Europe. At the end of World War II, when Stalin does that big land grab of Eastern Europe, he's going to claim, hey, you know what? We really took it on the chin hardcore with Hitler in World War II. We lost a lot of land and a lot of people in World War One. And because of the revolution, we weren't even invited to the peace treaty. So this is sort of kind of our consolation prize or our makeup for kind of being hosed in both World War One and also World War II. Bombing raids on Britain, Japan, and Germany are going to show this new attitude towards total war. You want to put down here next to number four, you want to put, please, that there was an attitude to destroy a country's capacity to wage war. I mean, because let's face it, if we bombed the munitions factories and if we also bombed the houses of the people that work in the munitions factories, those munitions factories aren't going to be able to make things that go boom. So the war effort of our enemy is going to be severely crippled. So we're going to attack as many sites as we possibly can. The government's mobilization of economies, people, and propaganda reached further than before. I mean, we see a little of this in World War One. I mean, it's pretty impressive in World War One. But again, World War Two, we go pro with it. With women in the war, huge numbers of women are going to work in industry and served in militaries. Unfortunately, because of this, there is also widespread instances of rape. We have the Holocaust, where some 6 million Jews are killed in genocide, and millions of others were also murdered in the camps. Although it is important to note, and you want to put this down here next to A underneath number 7. You want to put, please, here that this began as the T4 program. This began as the T4 program. The T4 program was a program to try to get rid of undesirable Germans within Germany. And the undesirables are going to be listed as anyone who is physically or mentally handicapped. And they use a medical justification in order to explain the deaths of these people, even though they're killing them. Ultimately here, it's going to boil over into the Holocaust, which is going to go after the Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Catholics, dissenters. I mean, it's going to like start to become a far bigger umbrella. The legacy, of course, of the Holocaust is a questioning of Western values, the migration of European Jews to Israel, and also the new crime of genocide. The concept of genocide, even the word genocide, does not exist until the Holocaust. Even though there's a similar thing that will happen to the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire during and immediately following World War I, there's no word to describe the desire to completely and totally remove everything about a group of people from their existence on the globe. There's no word to describe that until genocide, the term genocide, is created. World War II ultimately leaves Europe impoverished, with an industrial infrastructure in ruins and millions of people homeless or displaced. The weakened Europe, of course, is not going to be able to continue to hold on to its Asian and African colonies, and we'll get to that a little bit more in chapter 22. What also is going to help this situation to bring about an end to imperialism, and you want to put down here next to number 9, do you want to put down that nationalist movements are gaining strength and colonies are too expensive to maintain? Another outcome of World War II is that it consolidated and expanded the communist world. Soviet authorities are going to play up a virtual cult of World War II. In fact, even now, you go to any major city within the former Soviet Union, and there are dozens and dozens and dozens of memorials to World War II, to World War II war dead. I mean, they are all over the place, like in St. Petersburg, Moscow, Odessa, those places. We also see communist parties taking power across Eastern Europe as well. There's also, out of World War II, a growing internationalism. We have the creation of the United Nations as a means for peaceful conflict resolution. We also have the establishment of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, in 1945. What also is starting to happen, you want to put a star here next to number 12. We're also going to have a note with that here in a second. We see the new dominance of the United States as a global superpower. You want to put down, and this kind of like will go to explain why, you want to put down here next to 12 that World War II created a power vacuum with only two powers standing, which are the US and the USSR. If you think about it, going into World War II, we have five major powers. We have the United States, we have England, we have Germany, we have Japan, and we have the Soviet Union. The aftermath of World War II, England is basically a shell of its former self. It's no longer the economic powerhouse. It also is no longer the imperial powerhouse. Germany and Japan are both destroyed by by the war. So that kind of takes out everybody in between the United States and the Soviet Union who are going to step into this diplomatic and to this political void, which ultimately the competition between the two of them is going to give us the Cold War.